On the 7th of February 2026, the International Ahmadiyya Muslim Lawyers Association held their inaugural symposium in SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, the United Kingdom. The title of the symposium was International Law on Trial, Justice in a Divided World. The title was graciously given by Hazrat Khalifatul Masih V, may Allah be his helper. The purpose of the symposium was to explore whether and how international law can secure true justice in our divided world. Ahmadi Muslim lawyers from over 20 countries were joined by world-leading academics and thinkers to discuss the future of international law in the face of increased global conflicts, a fragile global geopolitical landscape, and a rejection of multilateralism. The day began with the recitation of the Holy Quran and an introduction from the chairman of the International Ahmadiyya Muslim Lawyers Association, Jonathan Butterworth. Following that, the audience were blessed to have read to them a letter sent by His Holiness, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih V, may Allah be his helper, which was addressed to the attendees of the symposium.
To all distinguished guests and members of the International Ahmadiyya Muslim Lawyers Association, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May peace and blessings of Allah be upon you. I am very pleased that the International Ahmadiyya Muslim Lawyers Association is hosting its inaugural symposium today. Certainly, it is a good thing that so many lawyers, most of whom are Ahmadis, but also some guests from around the world, are gathering today for the purpose of reflecting upon the standard of justice that exists in the world today, and moreover, to deliberate upon how true justice can be established. It is evident that we are living in an era in which the principles of justice and law are increasingly viewed with contempt. Indeed, recently the President of the United States brazenly stated that he, quote, does not need international law, end quote, and that the only limits upon him are his personal views and opinions. This statement accurately illustrates how the major powers have little interest in upholding international laws or those agreements they consider contrary to the narrow scope of their interests. In a similar vein, we observe that when nations ratify treaties or sign peace deals, whether short-term or permanent, the respective parties, especially those in a dominant position, are increasingly willing to violate the terms or to abandon them entirely, rather than to abide by the principles of justice and equity. As lawyers, I'm sure you will all have been taught to uphold and defend the rights of the innocent and those who have been oppressed or denied justice. However, regrettably, in today's world, the legal profession often fails to meet the demands of justice. Irrespective of whether a lawyer is advocating before national courts or standing before international tribunals, all too often, their first priority is to earn as much money as possible or to gain prestige or fame, or to climb the professional ladder, rather than to serve the cause of justice. Likewise, legislation that ought to serve as the bedrock of a just society, whether at a local, national, or international level, often itself contains elements of injustice or bias. Even where the laws are just, they are violated by the rich and powerful with seeming impunity. As noted, the United States President has made his contempt for international law quite clear, and similarly, other leaders, including Israel's Prime Minister, have proved themselves unwilling to be bound by laws or covenants. While they may verbally claim to uphold justice, in reality, they are governed solely by self-interest. It is a matter of great regret that in both Islamic countries and the non-Islamic world, justice is being trampled upon. Both within nations and in their dealings with one another, truth and justice are readily forsaken in the relentless pursuit of wealth and power. Sadly, many lawyers are also often motivated by personal interests or wealth. They proudly pledge to defend their clients' interest even when it is clear that their clients have committed great cruelties or injustices. Thankfully, not all lawyers are like this. For example, once, while I was traveling, a non-Ahmadi guest told me about an Ahmadi lawyer he knew. He said the Ahmadi lawyer was always honest, truthful, and fair in his dealings. Thus, every Ahmadi Muslim lawyer should aspire to emulate such excellent examples and ensure that all Ahmadi Muslim lawyers are known for their truth, integrity, and unwavering commitment to justice. Without doubt, it is necessary for lawyers to strive to right every wrong, to tirelessly advocate against injustice, and to work towards ending the conflicts that afflict the world. Indeed, this is a foremost duty for all Ahmadi Muslims and is the reason that I, for over 20 years, have been urging all nations and all peoples to adopt true justice and to strive for peace and security in the world. The history of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community attests to the fact that both as a community and individually, we have always striven for the establishment of peace and justice. In terms of the legal profession, one of the most eminent and distinguished lawyers of the 20th century was an Ahmadi, Sir Chaudhry Zafrullah Khan Sahib. Throughout his life, he played an outstanding role in advancing the cause of peace and justice. Uniquely elected both as President of the United Nations General Assembly and of the International Court of Justice, he faithfully upheld the demands of truth and justice at all times and forever sought to defend the rights of the weak and innocent with fearless conviction. He was never swayed by any vested interest, nor was he ever motivated by personal desires. Certainly, his example ought to serve as a model for all lawyers, especially those who are members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. In terms of Islam, the Holy Quran has presented a golden principle for establishing justice. It states that the enmity of another should never incite a person to act unjustly. Furthermore, it proclaims that one should be prepared to testify even against themselves and their loved ones for the sake of upholding truth and justice. However, instead of aspiring to such a magnificent standard of justice, it is observed that some lawyers are inclined to give poor advice to their clients in order to needlessly prolong cases and ensure that their legal fees continue to accumulate. At the international level and with regard to relations between nations, the Holy Quran states that if two nations enter into a dispute or conflict, it is up to other nations and relevant parties to strive to reconcile them. Thereafter, if after reconciliation is achieved, either party violates the terms of the agreement or the ceasefire, as is often the case in today's world, other nations should unite and use whatever pressure or force is necessary to end the injustice. After the conclusion of the Second World War, the United Nations was established for this very purpose, to maintain international order, peace, and security. Yet, it is starkly apparent that it has failed to fulfill this fundamental objective. I am sure some people are genuinely striving for the United Nations to fulfill its mandate and maintain international order. However, their efforts are being suppressed and frustrated by those seeking to advance their vested interests. Thus, selfishness continues to prevail over justice. It was for this reason that the League of Nations collapsed, and it is for this reason that the United Nations is now crumbling before our very eyes. Previously, there were only signs of the organization's decline, but today, its failure and impotence are unmistakably clear. Thus, at the World Economic Forum recently, the Canadian Prime Minister declared that a new world order is emerging in which multilateral organizations such as the United Nations are being ignored and relegated to irrelevance. Instead, he noted, countries are forming their own blocs and alliances based on their particular interests. In light of all of this, the question before all of you is how can justice prevail, and how can you as lawyers fulfill your obligations to defending the rule of law and the principles of justice? Words alone, no matter how grand or lofty, are meaningless. Hence, no matter how much one claims to desire peace or strive for justice, until genuine action is taken, nothing shall be achieved. In terms of practical efforts, Islam teaches that one should not seek only their rights. Rather, one must equally harbor the resolve to uphold and secure the rights of others. Only then can true justice be established. Yet, what justice can be expected in a world where major powers have a trump card in the shape of a veto power? This inherent injustice is something that I have, for over 2 decades, highlighted as a fundamental barrier to peace and security. Moreover, while those who work within the United Nations or other multilateral institutions, whether lawyers, experts, think tank representatives, or policymakers, are expected to deliver justice, they are constrained by those who fund their institutions or pay their salaries. Rather than standing up for what is right, all too often they take positions or reach decisions that align with the interests of their paymasters. In such a situation, how can justice and peace prevail in the world? Whether you will admit it or not, the truth is that those advocating before a court, whether at a local magistrate level, the High Court, the Supreme Court, or international tribunals, are often at the mercy of vested interests. In all too many cases, victory lies not with the truthful, but to the party with the deeper pockets. Moreover, many within the legal profession fear retribution from the rich and powerful, and so are too often guided by self-interest, self-preservation, and the pursuit of wealth at the expense of justice. Regrettably, in certain instances, such fears are well-founded. In recent times, cases have come to light in which very senior lawyers or judges who sought to pursue justice have faced threats, sanctions, and career destruction. Their reputations are left shattered. They are threatened and intimidated simply because they are unwilling to follow the dictates of the powerful. In such circumstances, how can international courts or the United Nations be expected to discharge their duties? As lawyers, you must stand in the face of the pressures or forces that you may encounter. At all times, the only fear that should govern your conduct is the fear of God Almighty. Moving forward, those nations and individuals who genuinely wish to see justice should unite and have the courage to stand before the major powers in defense of truth and justice. Yet, all signs point towards increased warfare and destruction. As I have repeatedly warned, I believe we are heading rapidly towards a cataclysmic world war in which conventional weapons shall be sidelined in favor of utterly inhumane and destructive weapons capable of annihilating cities and entire nations. Indeed, it appears that the first embers of such a world war have already been kindled. And if urgent action is not taken, the catastrophic consequences will surpass all human comprehension. Today, you have chosen international law on trial, justice in a divided world as your theme. And while this topic is commendable, the reality is that law and order at all levels of society, not just internationally, are on trial today. This, as I have already made clear, is because the fundamental principle of justice is under a sustained attack. Thus, let it be clear that until true and absolute justice are established, there can be no lasting peace in the world. Therefore, it is my sincere request to all of you that in your deliberations today, you reach a consensus amongst yourselves, pledging to make whatever sacrifices are required in order to defend justice and to focus seriously and wholeheartedly on this mission. If you are collectively resolved to do this, it is possible, at least to some extent, that you may be able to make a real and positive difference globally. Otherwise, as I have repeatedly stated, all signs point only towards unimaginable destruction. In conclusion, it is my prayer that the world recognizes the dangers that lie before us and set aside self-interests for the sake of truth and justice, so that we are able to safeguard ourselves and future generations. May Allah the Almighty grant you success in all your noble endeavors and enable you to always uphold the pledge you have made to pursue truth and justice. Ameen. With best wishes and prayers, Wassalam, yours sincerely, Mirza Masroor Ahmad, Khalifatul Masih V, head of the Worldwide Ahmadiyya Muslim Community.
The first panel of the day was entitled The Accountability Gap and Armed Conflicts. This panel aimed to explore the gap between the international law of armed conflict, which regulates the conduct of hostilities in international law, and accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The panel was chaired by Mubarak Wasim, a barrister practicing in London at Essex Court Chambers. He was joined on the panel by three speakers. Dr. Nada Ali is a full-time lecturer at SOAS in international law, whose research principally focuses upon the impact of international rules on developing countries. Dr. Ali's talk focused on the failings and shortcomings of international humanitarian law to the situation in Sudan. She discussed the conflict in Sudan and the ways in which it illustrates the limits of international humanitarian law.
In defense of these actions, a spokesperson for the armed forces intimated that the legitimacy of its actions is comparable to the legitimacy of the US action in Iraq, where collateral damage was acceptable given the military objective in question. So what does this say about international law? I think that the events in Sudan and Gaza are sobering in that they suggest a couple of things. First, that states are not fundamentally interested in human security, as opposed to, say, state security, even though the interest in state security itself is not clear in the situation in Sudan. And secondly, that international law and legal language can be weaponized against civilians, unless, of course, such action is guarded against by other accountability measures, including a free and fair press. So I think that international criminal justice is an unsuitable vehicle to address the kinds of conflict we see in Sudan because of a number of features or assumptions about the system. These assumptions include the idea that there is a clear distinction between victims and villains, that ethnic divisions are a mere construct of political elite who are intent on disregarding the law for their own ends, and that there actually exists a rule of international law that can replace and supplant the legal and political matrix of a rule of law state.
Jim Cavallaro is a visiting professor at Yale and Columbia Universities in the United States of America and the director of the University Network for Human Rights. Dr. Cavallaro's remarks and responses highlighted that international law and international institutions have primarily focused on the laws of war rather than preventing war in the first place. Dr. Cavallaro, in his remarks, urged us to move away from counting violations and towards preventing conflict.
I think collectively, my appeal would be for us as lawyers to move away from counting violations in places and to strengthen our efforts to address jus ad bellum.
Dr. Cavallaro praised and echoed Huzour's foresight and commitment to justice.
I can't emphasize enough how important it was, and I see that the head of the Ahmadiyyas has raised this as well. But Mark Carney basically said, it's always been a sham. We've always known that the global north can do what it wants in the global south. We just got a free ride. We could trade Canada using US sea lanes and pretending that we had a global order system. But now that you're calling me governor And now, right? And now that you're threatening to invade Canada, and now that you're threatening to invade Greenland, wait, we would like some rules. Okay, even with Venezuela, the response by the European Union was pathetic, right?
Yeah.
But now that it's Greenland, and so there's a moment here where I think, and we'll talk about this on panel 5, there's a real moment. I'm so glad we're having this conversation and this discussion and this conference. It's so opportune because I really think there's a moment now to change the dynamics of international law.
Dr. Andrea Maria Pelliconi is a lecturer in international law at the University of Southampton and a widely published author on the issue of demographic engineering. In her comments, she focused on the increased involvement of private actors and privatization in international law, and the inability of the current international legal system adequately to deal with those actors.
There is an increased involvement of private actors in what should really be either a reconstruction project led by the international community, but more prominently, something led by the Palestinian people of the Gaza Strip. But this is not within the picture that we have now, and it's increasingly delegated and outsourced to private contractors and private actors. Now, why is this important for our legal assessment? Well, because international humanitarian law, as I mentioned, is inadequate to restrain and regulate the activities of private actors. When functions such as delivery aid or the obligations of an occupying power to make sure that the local population are met with their basic needs are delegated to private actors, then the law itself is just inadequate inherently to deal with this type of situations because it doesn't necessarily place obligations on those actors.
His Excellency Adama Dieng, Special Envoy for the Prevention of Genocide and Other Mass Atrocities, and a former UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. Adama was unfortunately unable to be physically present for the symposium, but gave important video messages which emphasised that accountability is not just a legal concept, but a human one. His remarks also echoed Huzur's words in emphasising that the problem of modern international law is not the concept of the law, but the willingness of states to be bound by it and to follow it.
The world does not fail because it lacks information. It fails because it lacks courage. It should break our hearts and shame us that civilians can be destroyed in front of us while the law is treated as optional. So, what must we achieve to close this accountability gap? First, consistency. Justice must not depend on identity, alliances, wealth, or power. Second, prevention is accountability before the grave is dug, before the killing starts. Bear it. Third, defense of institutions. Accountability mechanisms must be protected from intimidation. The Quran gives us the clearest instruction. All you who believe, stand firmly for justice as witnesses for Allah, even if be against yourself or your parents or your kindred. That must be the standard, not convenience, not silence, not neutrality, justice. History will record not only what the criminals did, it will record what the world allowed and what the lawyers, the judges, and the states did when the law was tested. Let us be the generation that proves the law still belongs to humanity and that humanity will defend it.
The second panel of the day was entitled Constitutional Discrimination Against Religious Minorities. This panel aimed to outline the threat posed to international communities by restrictions on the freedom of religion and belief, particularly the use of blasphemy laws, and the shrinking space for the protection of asylum seekers. The panel was chaired by Farouk Aftab, General Counsel of the International Human Rights Committee and a leading human rights advocate. The panelists were as follows. Dr. Mohammed El-Sanusi is a member of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom and Executive Director of the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers. He urged the Muslim majority countries to embrace the Marrakesh Declaration and the Charter of Medina, proving that protecting persecuted Ahmadi Muslims reflects core Islamic values exemplified by the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Dr. El-Sanusi praised the clarity of the message delivered by Huzur, may Allah be his helper, and Huzur's focus on justice.
I want to again really applaud this particular symposium and appreciate the role that the Ahmadiyya Muslim communities and particularly the lawyers in advancing justice. The message from the head of the Ahmadiyya was very clear, which is mentioned that justice is really very critical, and we all need to work together collaboratively to actually advance justice around the world. The Marrakesh Declaration, actually, look it up, is actually based on the Medina Charter, Sahifat al-Medina, or Mithaq Medina, we call it, right? It's based on the Marrakesh based on that, where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Medina, basically, he said everyone, they have right to practice their religion freely. Muslim different factions, the Jewish community, the Christian communities, and called everyone living in that as a peninsula. So what happened 1,400 years later? So we work on the Marrakesh Declaration. It was issued 10 years ago. Is a theological tool to actually advance religious freedom. We need to make people aware of this, aware of the documents, and aware of these documents actually is providing religious freedom for everyone. But the Marrakesh Declaration is silent from, protecting, persecuted communities like the Ahmadiyya communities, who are, Ahmadiyya communities are Muslim communities, but they are facing persecution. But the document is silent of that. So we need to have a discussion how we can actually make that also as a part of the declaration.
Marco Respinti is a member of the International Federation of Journalists. Marco highlighted the serious plight facing the Ahmadi Muslim community in several places, including countries that could potentially offer protection or assistance. He praised the truth of Huzur's words about the United Nations.
The public. The case of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat is serious, even bloody, in several places. Yet the majority of the people, including those living in countries that could potentially offer protection or assistance, remain largely unaware. They often do not know who the Ahmadis are, simply, what they believe, or why they are persecuted to the point of death. For this reason, I initiated a modest and informational project consisting of a video documentary, which I am filming and doing through the auspices and collaboration of the International Human Rights Committee, which I do thank. IHRS has been a source of very important material on the persecution of the Ahmadis that one doesn't usually find in media. It will illustrate my documentary, and I had the privilege to interview for more than an hour His Holiness the Caliph privately. He's been so gracious to grant me that possibility.
Dr. Nicholas Levrat is the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. Dr. Levrat warned that the United Nations system faces a credibility crisis as countries ratify human rights treaties yet maintain discriminatory laws, like Pakistan's anti-Ahmadi provisions, without enforcement or accountability.
Thank you for your applause. It probably means that you realize how difficult it is to take the floor with the UN label under your name after all the harsh word we heard about how the UN is falling. And the problem is that this is absolutely true. The UN is dying, and it is a big problem. And I think the title of this symposium reflects this situation. And the problem is that at the international level, the UN has been building slowly an architecture to protect and promote human rights. But right now, promoting and protecting human rights at the international level is an uphill battle, and actually the hill is getting steeper every day. Nevertheless, there are paths worth to explore through UN way of dealing with this issue of blasphemy. I'm trying to work to build what I call a minority in society index. So to understand how the situation of minority group in relation to the dominant group or to society as a whole is evolving. We know many conflicts start with violation of the rights of minorities. So I hope also in the UN system or whatever will come after that, that we don't have this strict siloization, separation between human rights and security. Actually, human rights are part of security, especially minority rights. Thank you.
A video message from Dr. Nazila Ghanea, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, was also played. In that message, Dr. Ghanea highlighted that the freedom of religion and belief is a protected characteristic that should be safeguarded.
At today's conference, particular attention is being drawn to Ahmadis around the world, who time and again and over long decades have been singled out for such targeting and violations. The patterns of violations are not unique to Pakistan, but are especially egregious there. Propped up under the guise of constitutionality and numerous other laws and policies, and especially blasphemy provisions, very few areas of their peaceful lives remain safe. Indeed, Ordinance 20 of 1984 criminalized the very practice of their faith. When international human rights law standards, mechanisms, follow-up mechanisms and procedures and inquiries cannot protect against repeated acts of violence against a minority group, singled out simply due to their faith, we have to ask ourselves some hard questions about effectiveness. It is accountability rather than impunity that might restore trust in our international human rights order.
The third panel was entitled Climate Justice and Just Transitions, a multifaceted challenge for the international community. This panel aimed to evaluate the evolving role of international law in tackling climate change, including on the most vulnerable communities and states. This panel was chaired by Hafiz Kamran Mustafa, a legal consultant and UN delegate for accredited NGO observers at the UNFCCC, a PhD candidate and research associate at Durham University. The panelists on panel 3 were Kizza Hussain, an environmental lawyer and the founder of SHK Law Attorneys. Kizza Hussain highlighted some key climate litigation, including recent advisory opinions of the International Court of Justice and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and the efforts of the Global South in relation to climate justice. He stressed that the evolving legal duties trigger state liabilities for climate-related harms. Kizza also stated that the Ahmadi tradition reminds us that justice is sacred.
The Ahmadiyya tradition reminds us that justice is sacred, that the law must protect the vulnerable, not merely regulate power. We must use litigation strategically to advance climate accountabilities, defend environmental defenders as indigenous leaders, and of course indigenous leaders, but also push for international law from aspiration to enforcement. Climate justice demands courage not just from states, but from legal professionals willing to challenge entrenched interests. My distinguished colleagues, climate justice is not coming, it's already here. We are facing it, we're seeing it, and now we shall even endure its pain. The question before us is not whether the law can respond, but whether we must insist that it does. From African farmlands to Caribbean coastlines, from monolithic small island nations standing before the ICJ, the message is the same. Those least responsible must no longer pay the highest price. I would say, let's ensure climate justice is not a footnote in international law, but rather it's the guiding principle.
Zamzam Ibrahim is a British Somali activist working at the intersection of climate justice, education, and migration, who co-founded the Students Organising for Sustainability UK and helped launch the Climate Education Bill. Zamzam Ibrahim talked about the concept of just transitions and the vulnerabilities of the least developed countries and compromises they face at the international level in multilateral negotiations at UN conferences.
We talk about just transition as if justice will arrive automatically and eventually, and if we manage the process well enough. But justice delayed is not neutral. It is violence. For many communities, a transition being offered looks like this. phase out fossil fuels without guaranteed of their livelihoods. Let's expand renewables without addressing the land theft. Let's promote resilience while refusing reparations. Let's celebrate adaptation while normalizing loss. This is not just transition. This is a reallocation of harm. And international legal frameworks often legitimize these priorities. Investor protections over people, trade law over climate law, and state sovereignty over human survival. When international law refuses to confront historical responsibility, it quietly endorses ongoing extraction. International law insists on neutrality, but neutrality is an unequal world in a world that's not innocent. It's just ideological. It freezes injustice in a place and it calls it balance. And when law treats unequal states as formally equal actors, it erases colonial histories. When it separates climate harm from responsibility, it absolves polluters. When it frames displacement as a humanitarian issue rather than a political failure, it individualizes structural violence. The law does not simply fail to protect the vulnerable, it often disciplines them. By narrowing what they're allowed to demand, we talk about vulnerable communities as if their vulnerability is natural. It isn't. It isn't naturally caused. Vulnerability is produced by extraction, by borders, by debt, by racialized hierarchies of worth.
Dr. Ali Kamal Deen is the Director General of the Ghana Maritime Authority and an adjunct professor at Nelson Mandela University. Dr. Kamal Deen underlined the crucial role played by the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in recognising the stringent legal obligations for harm done to the marine environment due to increased levels of atmospheric carbon.
I have realized that most people don't tend to do more on the maritime front. So ITLOS is the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. ITLOS confirmed that climate change, actually, and also greenhouses are a major threat. Most importantly, for the first time, that greenhouses emission will constitute a pollution. The tribunal clarified that states have a binding obligation to mitigate the effect of greenhouses, for example. It also emphasized and elaborated on the due diligence rule. As some of us are aware, most international conventions will have one form or the other of the due diligence rule. But this is often applied as a general principle. In that most recent decision of ITLOS, it became clear that this is a stringent requirement and that it also imposes clear obligations on states to comply with. Therefore, for developing countries and those in the global south, we can demand a number of things. One, that for those states that are responsible to the largest contribution to climate change vulnerabilities and what we experience in, that they must take greater responsibility.
The fourth panel was entitled Between Liberty and Hatred, Defining the Limits of Free Speech. This panel assessed whether current approaches adequately balance the right to freedom of expression with the need to protect individuals from religious, racial, and other forms of hatred. The panel was chaired by Qudus Malik, Executive Director of Global Lawyers for Refugees and a leading international human rights lawyer and advocate. On the panel was Dr. Alison Scott Bowman, is a Professor of Society and Belief at SOAS, the author of 6 monographs, including How to Develop Free Speech on Campus. Dr. Scott Bowman examined how free speech is alternately expanded and restricted for political purposes, and warned of double standards and unintended consequences of restrictive legislation, while emphasising that genuine hate speech must neither be condoned nor protected.
Of the 100 or so, I can't remember actually how many universities we've got in this country, but there are very few. It's a minority that teach Islamic studies or the Islamic world or modern Muslim understanding. So this leads to self-censorship at an educational level, which means, and I work with Germany on this, means that young German Muslims are asking for more access to their own beliefs and to be able to discuss their own understanding on campuses. The students would like justice, they would like peace, they would like the killing to stop. and they want to talk about it. So they bring me in to run, I run big discussion groups where we set the parameters first. If there are difficult terms of wording that we don't want to use, so that we can have the conversation. If there are issues within the group, because I was working with people who were recent migrants to Sweden, and they said, please don't use the word migrant, because in Swedish it sounds so offensive. So we set up guardrails, if you like, some parameters for the conversation. But the point being that this is Sweden, a country with apparently no problems, and yet it's being visited by this issue taking place many miles away, which it's declining to resolve. Sweden is declining to have democratic, open debate about an issue which is affecting all of us and will continue to affect our children and our grandchildren for many years to come. What's happening in Israel-Palestine, what's happening in the wider area, the idea of having enemies that you create and keep on is a version of the forever war.
Dr. Yen Lee is the deputy head of the doctoral school at SOAS and a digital sociologist. Dr. Lee addressed the need for digital guardrails on online platforms, highlighting how current systems often amplify speech that should not be protected, while suppressing speech that should be.
I don't know if we are familiar. So it's, on the left, so that's a civil liberty lawyer in the States. She was participating in one of the anti-ICE protests recently. And this picture was on the right. That picture was from the White House official Twitter X account. Basically, they posted this AI manipulated picture. So on the left, the actual what happened on the day was that she was courageous, she was calm when she was arrested. But they created this video image of her being hysterically crying, resisting, and they posted that. So now, and people were kind of okay with that, or at least, what can we do? And even the White House, they were saying that, oh, it was just a meme. It was a meme, so we just forwarded. I have no responsibility there.
Peter Oborn is associate editor of the Middle East Eye and a former political columnist at the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph. Peter Oborn reflected on the erosion of journalistic integrity, neutrality, and fairness, explaining how entrenched power and political pressure have made it increasingly difficult to report uncomfortable truths about bad actors.
And the first point, of course, is then there is no such thing as free speech. It doesn't exist, and nor should it. The primary issue today is the attempts by or the most dangerous issue of the right to legitimise attacks on minorities. We thought we'd got rid of racism in the 60s, really 70s. Something profound happened, but we're now getting it back. The use of disgusting racial terms is now defended on the basis that it's free speech. The fact that there is the right is demanding and insisting on a special exemption to defame and attack British Muslims. Actually, it's an extraordinary business, this. The concept of Islamophobia is actually denied, that there isn't such a thing, even though there is anybody with open eyes in our society can see that there is.
The attendees of the symposium were also able to watch a short video produced by MTA International on the life and work of Hazrat Chaudhry Muhammad Zafarullah Khan Sahab, drawing on interviews from those who know his work and his personal life to explain how such a luminary was forgotten by Pakistan.
He was such an extraordinary man with such great prestige in the UN.
I think he's been a forgotten figure. His history, if you like, is blotted out deliberately by the government.
In London, outside King's College, they celebrate this great alumnus. And here's a country whose citizen he was, does not even want to mention him in the textbook.
Uruguay, Venezuela, Yemen.
Je déclare Son Excellence Sir Zafarullah Khan élu président de la 17e session ordinaire de l'Assemblée générale. I am deeply moved at the honor you have done me in electing me to serve you as President of the General Assembly. I am deeply conscious of the heavy responsibility this mark of your confidence places upon my shoulders. And I pray God humbly, sincerely, and earnestly of His grace and mercy so to guide me in His wisdom that in the discharge of my responsibilities I might prove worthy of your confidence.
Sir Muhammad Zafrullah Khan was one of the principal architects of Pakistan's foreign policy and one of the most influential Muslim statesmen of the 20th century. At the birth of Pakistan, few men were as trusted or as indispensable as Sir Zafrullah Khan.
Sir Muhammad Zafrullah Khan is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Pakistan. A lawyer, scholar, and statesman, he is one of the most distinguished of Muslims and is particularly known for his religious fervor. He was president of the All India Muslim League in 1931, leader of the Indian delegation to the League of Nations Assembly in 1939, and more recently, leader of the Pakistan delegation to the United Nations.
Pakistan will do all that might lie within its power towards the alleviation of all forms of human suffering and distress, and the promotion of beneficent cooperation among the nations for the general raising of standards of living and the fostering of liberty and tolerance throughout the world.
The years following the Second World War marked the collapse of empires and the emergence of new nations.
India and Pakistan were the first examples of states that became independent after the Second World War. So both Pakistan and India then led this vanguard, if you like, to encourage further developments, further decolonizations. Zafrullah Khan was effectively the spokesman for this early period of decolonization.
Evil is the denial of the brotherhood of men, of all men, whatever the color of their skins, white, dark, brown, or yellow, and the arrogant assumption that certain sections of mankind are entitled as of right to exercise domination over other sections of their fellow beings, irrespective of whether this domination manifests itself in Korea, in Indochina, in Tunisia, in Morocco, or elsewhere.
He was highly skilled because, of course, as a statesman in colonial India, he was making the same arguments. So he was supporting the independence of Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, and of course in Indonesia.
And not only has there been no refraining on the part of the dominant power from acts or measures likely to aggravate the tension that then prevailed, but the tension that today prevails is more acute. And all this acuteness is due not to any act on the part of the people of Morocco, to which legitimate objection could be taken, but to the policies and the acts of the dominant power.
His very powerful speeches, his oratory skills, which were magnified from the United Nations and in the media at the time, he soon became an icon in the Arab world.
هو كان شخصية غير عادية يعني. لكن شفته مرة نازل من يعني كان راكب اسانسير ونازل من اسانسير ورأيته بنفسي الأعداد الكبيرة من المندوبين اللي اتلموا حواليه. يعني هو كان شخصية فذة ولا شك إنه هو معروف إنه أبلغ خطيب تحدث في الأمم المتحدة. معجبين أولا بلغته وبعدين بمنطقه وبمعلوماته. يعني هو شخص فذ بكل معاني الكلمة.
He was a very eminent and respected jurist, and his voice carried weight. I myself have had the opportunity to hear his speeches. I don't think anybody could have done a better job than he did.
Yet despite his international stature, Sir Zafrullah Khan's legacy within Pakistan would take a very different turn.
The greatest, I think, a fallout of this sectarian and intra-Muslim tension has been the plight of Ahmadiyya community, who have not only been legally persecuted, but actually face physical threats and repeated acts of violence.
in September 1974. The issue was brought to the table of the National Assembly, where lengthy discussions went on to reach a conclusion which was actually predetermined. And Ahmadis in the Constitution of Pakistan were declared non-Muslims. So Hazrat Zafrullah Khan Razil being amongst the forefathers of the nation, his name has been totally erased from all textbooks. He is just simply not there, as if he was non-existent.
I find it very sad when I think of what his dreams must have been and what his hopes must have been. And he was such a champion of minority rights himself. And it is my fervent hope that he will one day be honored and respected for the great Ahmadiyya Muslim that he was, the great Pakistani patriot that he was, and the great international servant that he was.
Following from that video was a talk by Dr. Victor Katan. Dr. Victor Katan is an associate professor of public international law at the University of Nottingham and one of the world's foremost scholars on the career of Chaudhry Zafrullah Khan. In his talk, Dr. Katan outlined the illustrious career of Chaudhry Zafrullah Khan and emphasised that he was someone who always stood up for what he believed in, even when he had to stand against the whole world.
Sir Zafrullah played an important role not only in the history of Pakistan, but also in the early period of decolonisation that saw several nations in North Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia become independent nations. He was one of those statesmen who knew how to navigate the corridors of power at both the League of Nations and the United Nations. And so this is an important moment to also learn about the politics inside the International Court of Justice in the 1960s. It also provides us with an insight into the moral integrity of Sir Zafrullah, who always stood up for what he believed was right, as we saw in that video, even if he had to stand against the whole world, even if he was the obstinate one saying no, 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 he was that person. Sir Zafrullah Khan belonged to those elder statesmen whose lives spanned 2 world wars. He was articulating self-determination at a time when the nations of the Third World were still a minority. So the irony is, he said he was a dissenter, he was on the losing side in 1947. The irony is, had that debate taken place 10, 15 years later, he would have been on the winning side.
That's right. Exactly.
Because in 1947, the European states were still the majority in the political organs of the United Nations. So he lost on numbers, but his argument won in the end because the UN proclaimed this right 13 years later, and now it's customary international law. Now it's considered a jus cogens norm of international law. So his arguments were the ones that won. One area that I have done research on and I have published on, but I'd like to look at more is his role, again, in the 1940s in India, Kashmir, and Palestine.
The fifth and final panel of the day was entitled, "What is the role of international law in ensuring justice in a divided world?" The panel was chaired by Jonathan Butterworth, the chairman of the International Ahmadiyya Muslim Lawyers Association and a barrister specialising in international law and human rights. He was joined by Dr. Jim Cavallaro, visiting professor at Yale and Columbia and executive director of the University Network for Human Rights. Jim Cavallaro spoke on the evident failure of the UN system and the need to reimagine international legal protections, including by strengthening regional organisations, particularly in the Global South.
So that's where we are, what to do. And I am of two minds. And we've been talking about this all day. I see two paths. I'm not sure which path is more desirable. So one path is to cling to the United Nations, to, despite everything, try to strengthen the United Nations, right? Recognizing that the Security Council is fundamentally flawed, that the United States has the veto and other countries do, although they use it rarely. But in the hopes that one single global body can deliver us if we make it strong enough, right? I don't lean in that direction. I lean in the direction of, okay, the mask has fallen, the legitimacy of the system has been made manifest. The United States has decided we're going to have a club of thugs called the Board of Peace, which is a privatized group of highly suspect states and businesses. We're undermining the legitimacy of the United Nations with the help of the Security Council and the United Nations itself. So we're going to move away from a single, unified, global body. And if that's what's happening, then I think we need a competitor. And what we need is a coalition of states, a coalition that brings together the best of Europe, European states that are willing and maybe forced or kicked, dragging and screaming to work towards a governance body that's just. States in South America and the Americas, in the global South, South Africa, other regional leaders, Kenya, Nigeria, in Africa, Asian countries, India, Indonesia, China, bring those states together and use the economic and other pressure of those states in a body. One of my fears in making a proposal like this, I don't know how many people are listening to me or supporting this kind of proposal, is a quote from Antonio Gramsci, who said, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born," which describes, I think, our moment. But this is the kicker that's problematic. Now is the time of monsters.
He was joined by Professor Satvinder Jas, Professor of Law at King's College London and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Satvinder Jas addressed the rapid erosion of international refugee and human rights protections, which he explained is being driven by anti-migrant and often anti-Muslim sentiment. Professor Satvinder Jas also praised the Ahmadi Muslim community for following one leader in the person of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih V. May Allah be his helper.
I mean, the Islamic model is a very, very good one. I mean, Islamic refugee law, for example, always takes the view that the stranger is actually the person to be welcomed and to be treated with generosity, with open arms. And very few people talk about Islamic refugee law. You people are very fortunate, I often think. I mean, I see, for example, I was explaining this last night, Islam as at the bottom of a pyramid. This is the pyramid. And at the top is Judaism. This is the Judeo-Christian tradition. At the top is Judaism. In the middle is Christianity. And at the bottom, it's not bottom in the sense that you think, at the bottom you've got Islam. And the way I conceptualize it in this way is this. Judaism, the founding father Abraham, father of all religions, but very thin in terms of its judicial principles compared to then Christianity. But at the bottom with Islam, you've got rules for everything. You've got a vibrant system of law that you can draw upon. You've got systems of justice. You've got understandings of that you can draw upon. I mean, one easy one that comes to my mind is zakat. My own religion, Sikhism, has borrowed actually from Islam, the idea of zakat. There would be no poverty in the world because what would happen is everyone would be looking after the poor. All right? I mean, it's inbuilt within the religious system itself. So I think you've got strengths there that you can draw upon and use that. But as I say, with the Ahmadi faith, at least you've got a figurehead who actually you can rally around. The one other thing that I've often thought about, which hasn't been touched upon in relation to Europe and the West, which I think is worth thinking about, is this. I often think about Islam as a competitor, rival religion to Christianity. So forget not the fact that Islam had pretty much taken over the whole of Europe in the Middle Ages. From 711, much of the Iberian Peninsula is actually controlled by the Moors, right the way through to 1492. That's hundreds of years in Spain and the like and so on. Actually, Europe is run by the Muslim Moors. And then later on, by reconquest, Christianity takes over through Isabella and later on by Ferdinand of Spain. And it's only in 1609 that the Muslims are then expelled from Europe. In many ways, I think the reason what we get these decisions against Islam or this knee-jerk reactions against Islam, I think is that way back in their psyche, many Europeans see this as a competitor rival tradition that they don't want to take over. And I think that is something that you need to think about a bit more, because it's forgotten that for several hundred years, actually, the Muslims actually ruled much of Europe.
You know, I was really impressed by His Holiness' message emphasizing this notion of justice. We need to bring justice to everyone. And His Holiness actually talk about everybody has a role to play in order to bring justice. We need that collaborative efforts. If we have justice, we can eliminate all of these discriminations. Justice for everyone, regardless. Even for your enemy, you have to bring justice. So I think we need to just push hard for His Holiness' message. He has been saying this, as he mentioned, over 2 decades now. It is the responsibility of these lawyers' associations for the Ahmadiyya communities to move that forward and to bring this message to the international communities.
I thought the message was remarkably lucid. And again, I'm not surprised that you came up with the idea of international law on trial, given what the Khalifa was saying about the moment that we're living in and the threats to the fundamental principles of peace, dignity, equality, national sovereignty of different states, etc. I thought his message clearly set out what the challenges are. And then from there, within the faith-based community that you represent, as a lawyer, you know, where do you bring together your personal values and what I can do with the law?
I thought that the section on Zafar Khan was amazing. I mean, because he's such a distinguished man. It's been rather erased in the history of Pakistan. And so to be reminded of him, and particularly in the context of that great apartheid judgment of the mid-60s, I found very interesting by the ICJ, and of course, particularly at a time when the International Court of Justice is now contemplating the matter of a genocide in Gaza. I was absolutely riveted by that. I think it's been a first-class event.
I think in the absolute horrible world we're in, when it's important to remind ourselves that they were very good figures, even if that was in the past, and we can learn from them, learn about their lives, learn about their hopes and aspirations, and also how they tried to make a more just world, and indeed succeeded in making a more just world with social media, controlled by billionaires, basically lying, to put it bluntly, about a lot of things. It's important that we have these, figures of good, of hope, aspirational figures, especially for the youth, for people who are looking for another vision, another idea of ordering the world. It doesn't have to be the way that it's going at the moment.
I think he's truly a pious man, and he knows that every word he says, God is looking at him, and he has a responsibility to be honest, first of all, in face of God. He cannot pretend. But I also understand that His Holiness says that to warn people, because he adds, unless people will not do something to stop. And we are here to try to begin to do something. And this is why the message from symposia like this should go around the world and alarm people and say, we're living on the verge of an abyss. Let's step back.
I was very impressed by the opening remarks of His Holiness. I think for me, the most important aspect of it is the realization that geopolitics matter and the behavior of powerful states matter. And the idea that in order for us to ensure justice for those who are affected by suffering as a result of conflicts, we need to be able to speak truth to power. And for me, that is a very powerful message that I hardly heard from political leaders or religious leaders before.
The idea that we could come here together to dissect different topics and issues that are affecting humanity, and then be able to propose solutions. And all these solutions goes back also to action. Because I know the Ahmadiyya community, Ahmadiyya society, they are not just talking. They are on the ground implementing action, humanitarian support, ideological discourse. All this is meant to make us be able to be impactful in whatever cause we pursue. So that's why I'm blessed to be here, and I hope for this gathering even next year happens and other years.
Virtually every external panelist today cited Hazur's message. A UN official, the Special Rapporteur of Minority Rights, not only did he acknowledge what Hazur said, he even said in his own remarks that indeed Hazur is correct, the UN is dying, and there should be more bravery needed to defend international institutions, and the stakes are, what Hazur said, are cataclysmic. If this is not done by Ahmadi lawyers, this will continue to lead to a raging world war that's already begun. So in many ways, what Hazur is saying, Ahmadi Muslim lawyers have to rise up and stand together like a wall of molten lead to fight against injustice, and we must do so urgently in order to prevent world war.
The International Ahmadiyya Muslim Lawyers Association would like to thank all guests, all panellists, and all those who helped to ensure that the symposium was a successful one.